Alright, Chapter 17, Part 5. This is the last session. And here we're going to kind of tie in everything we've learned about glaciers and what's going on in the world. Polar ice sheets and the sea level. So, I know we've talked about it in class many times, and you've probably seen many videos. One of the main concerns with climate change is that as the glaciers melt, as the sea ice melts, that water goes somewhere and it gets into the ocean, and sea level will rise. So let's examine this. If you look at all the ice in the world, the cryosphere, right? Of the total ice in the world, 91% of it is in Antarctica. The South Pole is basically a big, huge block of ice, 2 miles thick, the size of North America. And that is the vast majority. Greenland has about 8%. So all the glaciers in the mountains are less than 1%. Now, what does that mean? If all the ice in Antarctica was to melt, sea level would rise probably about 240 feet. If all of Greenland was to melt, that would be 21 feet. And the glacier is about a foot and a half. All told, if we lost all glaciers and global ice, if the Earth got to be that warm, and it has in the past, sea levels could be as much as 263 feet higher. That means, by the way, by comparison, if sea level was 260 feet higher, all of Florida would be underwater by a good amount. The tallest part in Florida, I believe, was 150 feet above sea level. In fact, most of the southeastern United States, Atlanta would be pretty much on the coastline. New York City, Washington, D.C., Los Angeles, San Francisco, all of these would be underwater. So let's look at these by area. Let's focus on Greenland and Antarctica. So Greenland and Antarctica has some huge issues, and that's why scientists are actually monitoring them closely. And what we do know in Greenland, that the glacial mass balance that we talked about is negative. In other words, the glaciers in Greenland for the past several years are losing more water than they are gaining. They're shrinking, and that water is going directly into the ocean. One of the big things is albedo, right? We talked about this before. As the ice melts in Greenland, more rock is exposed, more open land, which absorbs more sunlight and helps keep it warmer. And so what we notice is in Greenland, it's getting warmer more often, it's staying warmer, and also the glaciers that leave the ice cap and get to the ocean are flowing faster than ever before. So this shows you right here the melt season anomaly. What this means is that this is the normal amount of days the glaciers melt. So right here. And if the average is, say, 2 days a year, that's what this is. This means that there are 25 less days of melting or 25 days more of melting. And you can see the vast majority of the edge of the glacier is seeing higher or more days of melting, and it's losing more and more balance. So another thing we see is as it gets warmer, the top of the glacier melts. We're seeing more superglacial lakes and streams on top of the ice. So that means it's melting. But the problem with this is that that water, right? If that's melted ice, that water is warmer than ice, isn't it? Because if the water was colder than ice, it'd freeze. So this ice could be 31 degrees and this water could be 32. It's going to melt. And what happens is these glacial lakes on top basically melt all the way down eventually through cracks to the ice to the bottom. And they get between the rock and the ice. And the more water between the rock and the ice, the easier it is for the glacier to slide downhill. And so what they've noticed is that not only do we see more ice melting on top of the glacier every year, but the glaciers have actually increased their speed at which they're flowing downhill as much as 50%, which means more meltwater, more glaciers coming down, and more icebergs. Now in Antarctica, very similar actions. We're seeing increased melting, which has allowed ice shelves to break apart. Now, ice shelves in Antarctica can be huge. Some of them can be a couple 100,000 square miles. And what happens is a glacier comes down to the ocean, remember, and it kind of floats over the ocean, this ice sheet. But if that ice sheet breaks off and floats away, the ice behind it now can move even faster. And so what happens is, as ice sheets break apart, and then these are some pretty large areas of ice, 472,000 square kilometers. This is bigger than, I think, Wyoming or Montana. As they break apart, the ice behind it can now move faster. So we're seeing that increasingly happen. And in fact, scientists said that there's a couple ice sheets here that in our lifetime will disappear. Now, what does that mean? We do know this. In the last 100 years, sea level has been rising at about 3 millimeters a year on average. So about a tenth of an inch. Now that may not seem like much, but that means in 10 years, 1 inch. 20 years, 2 inches. And that adds up. It's cumulative. Right? Your video for Hurricane Superstorm, the Sandy hurricane, right, said that at the very least it made that storm surge that much greater. So we know that Greenland and Antarctica are about a third of this. The question and the issues we have is this: how much worse will it get? Well, it's hard to say because ice sheets don't always act the way we think they do. In other words, their behavior is nonlinear. So it might go faster, it might go slower. But we do know this: over 100 million people around the world live in areas where the elevation is less than 3 feet above sea level. So that means as this happens, as oceans rise, they have to go somewhere. Um, you're going to hear the term coming up in the news more and more, if you haven't heard already, of climate refugees. So I'm going to use the idea of Bangladesh. The nation of Bangladesh is one of the most densely populated areas on Earth. It's right between India and Myanmar, and most of the land is about 4 feet above sea level. It's very, very densely populated because it's very fertile land. It grows 4 to 5 crops of rice a year. But the people that live there are poor farmers. But as the water comes up closer, they have to move. And now the question becomes, where will they go? They don't have more land to farm, so they go to the cities and they crowd the cities, but they don't have skills to live in the city. And so that's a huge issue. And the nation of Bangladesh could pretty much disappear in the next 50 years. And 500 to 600 million people will have to go somewhere. So these are things that we have to deal with. And on that note, thank you for listening. I'll talk to you again soon, and we'll be talking about Chapter 18 next.